Can we start? Brilliant. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see a packed room for this really important topic that I'm sure is on all of your minds here in Davos, the future of globalization. I'm Thorold Barker. I'm the editor for Europe, Middle East, and Africa at the Wall Street Journal. And I'm delighted that we have this fabulous panel here to discuss where globalization stands today, the challenges and opportunities ahead, and how business and government need to adapt in the coming years. We have Pamela Coke-Hamilton, to my left, Executive Director of the International Trade Center, Tarek Sultan, Chief Executive of Agility, a global supply chain company based in Kuwait and many other places. We have Nicolas Aguzin, also known as Gucho, and we'll call him Gucho for today, Chief Executive Officer of Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing, and Loic Tassel, President of Procter & Gamble in Europe. So please welcome our excellent panel, if you can. Little clap, thank you. So I just want to start, this is a complicated topic, so I want to start very quickly, and I want you engaged in the room. So we're going to do a quick show of hands to start off with on the state of globalization. And I want you to put up your hand, and I'm going to tell you the two answers first. Is globalization advancing or retreating? So, who thinks it's still advancing? Wow. Okay, a smattering of hands. And who thinks it's retreating? Fantastic. Okay, good. So we are in the deglobalization camp in this room. So we're going to kick off on that basis with... No, you're not meant to do what they're told. So we're just going to kick off by asking all of the panelists to give a quick view from their lens, because they all come from pretty different viewpoints on this, what their perspective is, just a short encapsulation of that. So I'm going to start with you, Tarek. So what is your 2 minutes on this?
Well, I should probably get up and leave, judging by the votes. But really, we're seeing a severe constraint at the level of the supply chain. And part of that is a result of how globalized the supply chain and the economy has become. So if anything, we see the pressures on globalization continuing and accelerating. Most of you are probably focused on some of the geopolitical events that could potentially have impetus or have an implication for the supply chain, COVID, Ukraine, many others. But I think it's clear to me that the positive forces that are driving globalization, and then there's really two major ones, the changing structure of demographics and the way that technology is changing, is far more important than any of those geopolitical forces. So I think over time, the law of economics and the changing nature of demographics and technology will continue the path of globalization, albeit maybe at a different pace or in a different way, but it's always in flux.
Fantastic. Gucho, what's your perspective?
Yeah, well, as an Argentine that actually spent most of his professional life in the US, and now I'm based in Hong Kong, running the Hong Kong Exchange. Obviously, globalization is a very important issue to me personally, and I do believe that as a result of what has happened and the impact of globalization in the world, there's a lot of people that have been clearly taken out of poverty over the last 30, 40 years, and it has resulted in great benefits for the whole world. Now, being based in Hong Kong today, which is the most international city of China and the most Chinese city outside of the mainland, we have now a special, unique role to make sure that we follow on onto that, to try to connect East and West and generate flows between East and West, and make sure that we maintain that current situation. And by doing that, we strongly believe that we will continue to promote prosperity.
Okay, but do you think we are still globalizing, or do you think
I think we're stalling.
You're stalling.
We're stalling, but I can't say that we're totally deglobalizing.
So you're somewhere in the middle.
Some areas are deglobalizing. Okay. So if you think about certain specific sectors, you may see some deglobalization, but when you add it up all together, I don't think that the facts support the statement that we're deglobalizing.
Okay, well, we're going to come to the facts at the end.
Yeah.
Once you guys have given your opinions, we will get the facts from Pam at the end. Lloyd, what's your perspective on this?
So, good morning, everyone. I lead P&G in Europe. P&G stands for Procter & Gamble. You might not know our company, but I hope and trust you're buying our brands. The most important point, right? Ariel, Tide, Pampers, Gillette, you name it. If you are, you're joining the club of 5 billion consumers. So feel not lonely, right? And that's the benefit of globalization. We're almost a 200-century-old company, so we're an old company. For the first 100 century, we were essentially selling in the US, our home market. Globalization has allowed us to increase in scope and now impact 5 billion consumers a year. So here is my statement for all of you. Globalization is not a good thing. It's a great thing. It is a great thing. It has allowed 5 billion consumers to get access to high quality, reliable, trustworthy, innovative product they would not have been able to access otherwise. So we'll come to the question, is it moving, is it pausing? I think it's temporarily pausing. Our responsibility as leaders is to continue to ensure globalization keeps progressing, not because it is in the interests of the companies, which would be right anyway, but because it is in the core interest of consumers.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll dig into all of that. But Pam, give us, you run the International Trade Center, give us the facts here. What do the statistics tell us is actually going on?
Okay, thanks a lot. First of all, let's just say that globalization has actually lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. And right now it's caught in what I call the perfect storm of the 3 C's: the COVID, the climate change, the conflict. We know this. And each one of those by itself can actually deal a body blow to globalization. And we've heard this before. So there's this whole harbinger of doom, and it's all dying, and we're all going to fall apart. But the facts don't support this. And the statistics show that if you look at the measurement of what constitutes globalization, which is the percentage of trade as a percentage of global GDP, in 2008, it was 51.2%. In 2021, it was 42.5%, which is a minimal drop, 1. And 2, it's the same as it was in 2016. The second issue is that trade in intermediate goods, according to the WTO, has actually increased across all regions, with 50% in Africa. And a lot of this has to do with COVID. It has to do with PPEs, has to do with medical supplies, has to do with vaccines. And so I'll get to the digital services if you want me to, but do you want me to?
Keep going, it's very interesting.
The data, there's a misconception, I think, that is driving this narrative, which is a focus on goods. Oh, the shipments aren't moving, and this is happening, and you know the goods are falling, and so on. In comparative numbers, that may be true, but in real nominal numbers, it's the trade for the last year in 2022. Global trade of goods was 28.5 trillion, which is a record high. A record high. It's never been reached. So if globalization is dying, I don't know what's causing that number, but that's one thing. The second is on digital. Basically, what has happened is digital went on steroids during COVID. And if any of you have been on steroids, you know the impact, both good and bad. But what has happened is the digital economy has driven a shift in how even goods are being looked at. So for example, let's take digitally enabled services. Online education shifted. But I still paid the same amount for my son to go to college, which I am still upset about. He sat online for 1.5 years, and as a matter of fact, the fees increased because they had to figure out how to teach them online. So universities lost nothing. Telemedicine. My doctor didn't even bother to see me. They just came online and said, okay, what medication do you need? Everything has shifted, but the digitally enabled services has just exploded. Let's talk about tourism. Tourism was the largest hit, simply because everybody was shut down. But Florida, in the last quarter of 2021, has hit their 2025 benchmark. 2025, last year. Why? Because everything has bounced back. Maldives, remote work. That is going to transform the tourism industry as we know it. Because people are not going back to the office, but they're going to Maldives, or they're going to Barbados, and they're working from there. It's a great idea. I don't want to say it in front of my staff, but you know, it really would be great if you could work from, you know, the sunshine. But it is transforming. It's not deglobalizing. It is simply shifting and adapting and evolving.
Brilliant. So let's dig into some of those different elements. We've talked about goods, services, digital, and movement of people. Lloyd, let's start with you on goods. You have big supply chains around the world. You produce a lot of, as you mentioned, various products that 5 billion people use. Are you, as a company, changing the way those are configured in the light of what we've seen in recent years, whether it's the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, concerns over China? Are you actually changing those, not immediately, but over time?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's probably the area that is talked the most. In the physical world of real goods, production, manufacturing, shipments of containers, there is clearly a change. Our big company, global company like us, was looking at globalization with 3 simple ideas: free flow of capital, respect of IP, reliable transport. The first 2 are still there. The reliability of the global supply chain has been deeply disturbed over the last couple of years. What's the impact? It means whilst we were previously looking at transfer between where the goods are produced and when they're consumed, in a simple, reliable transport, we are now bringing into the equation the cost and the resilience of the supply chain, which is a very new notion we all talk about. That was not in our mind 3 years ago. What's the simple outcome is we are looking at a more regional supply chain setup than the one which we used to have. The price to pay or the time to wait to get some of our products from China in Europe is not compatible anymore with our industry that is called FMCG. And F stands for fast moving, right? If your container is stuck in Shanghai, it is not fast moving anymore. So there is an impact here where we are relooking, regionalizing our supply chain with a very simple goal for us, not to betray any secrets, which is 90+% of what we're going to be selling in Europe will be produced in Europe. That's a profound change, which I think is going to be a lasting one. It will go beyond the next wave of COVID crisis. I can see it being a trend till the end of this decade. It is not a pause, or it is not a contrast to globalization, but on the supply part, the regional reliability of transport is going to be clearly playing an increased role.
And just a quick follow-up on that. In an inflationary world, which we live in, is that going to be inflationary, or does that not make a difference?
We are entering an inflationary world which has not much to do with that point. It has a lot.
Will that make it worse, is my question.
It has a lot to do with the higher cost of energy. Of course, the closer the plant is to the source of consumption, the less energy you're going to be using. The impact is going to be very marginal. Okay. It's more the reliability of the supply chain. Again, in fast-moving consumer goods, if you're waiting for your container for 2 months, you're missing the sales. It has to be available in 2 weeks, probably in some cases in 2 days. That is only largely achieved if you're having a more regional-based supply chain.
Thank you. Tarek, I just want to follow up with you on this. We had a story in the Wall Street Journal the other day about Apple looking whether it can diversify its supply chain a bit away from China. What are you seeing in terms of big companies and what they're doing with their supply chains, and to what extent is more of a decoupling possible nowadays, given the importance of China in particular for manufacturing?
Well, see, it's a difficult one. If you're talking about a company like Apple, the reason they manufacture in China in the first place is not just because of cost. In fact, the costs in China are probably higher than they are in other economies. But they manufacture there because of the ecosystem of technologists and suppliers that, in my opinion, it's very difficult to moving that ecosystem is something that takes time and takes effort and requires a strategy. So in the short term, I see some tactical moves, but in the long run, it really depends how you perceive some of these geopolitical events. And let's go through them. COVID. COVID hopefully is a transient, we've been saying it for 2 years, but hopefully it's a transient issue. But one of the big problems with the COVID crisis was the amount of stimulus that governments injected into the economy. So guess what happened? I mean, when the supply chain and logistics industries, the manufacturers couldn't keep up with that demand. Hopefully, well, from this perspective, hopefully, because there's going to be a recession coming our way, that will take care a little bit of this kind of government's ability to continue pumping stimulus into their economy. So hopefully that's self-correcting. Again, Ukraine and Russia, we hope is temporary. I mean, it might be a little bit of wishful thinking, but let's not see this as a long-term sort of driver. Hopefully, short to a medium-term factor. And then the discourse between China and the West. I think that's something that's going to, take some time to work out. But I do see it. I don't see it as terminal. I just see it as a period of time where there is going to be some discussions, some negotiations. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think both parties have and both have an incentive in actually making it work. And then, for me, the only one of those factors is permanent is the climate aspect. And then if you look at the climate aspect and you look at how it's impacting globalization, it's actually cutting in different ways. I mean, if you look at energy, for example, there's going to be maybe a move to biofuels, to hydrogen. That creates opportunities for globalization and opportunities around the supply chains, as well as disruptions. When you look at all of these factors, to me, the ones that seem permanent are the ones that are driving globalization today. And I'll just touch on a few of these. The rise of the middle class. I mean, if you take a country like Indonesia, 270 million people, 90 million people don't have access to bank accounts today. So just, you think the impact of having a company like GoTo basically offer online banking service, getting 90 million people into the economy, that's going to have a significant impact on the growth of Indonesia on the one hand, but also the ability of these countries to participate in the continued globalization. Emerging markets, they are basically consuming 66% of manufactured goods. To me, that tells you that globalization is here to stay. If you think of the traditional manufacturing bases, well, the emerging markets are driving demand. Again, the youthfulness of some of these economies in Africa. In Africa, I think 70%, if my statistics are right, 60% are below the age of 25. So that suggests to me that there's going to be more demand for globalization. So
you're saying it depends which lens you're looking at it. If you're looking at it from poorer countries that are developing, globalization is healthy. If you're looking at it from the US, where people have said on this panel a few times that it's been this great benefit for the world, and of course that's true from a global perspective. Inequality has come down. A lot of people have been taken out of poverty, but obviously there is a different narrative in the US around what that's meant for blue-collar jobs in manufacturing. So, there is possibly a different lens that people are seeing, and hence the disconnect with the room as well.
So one aspect that's been very troubling is with the constraint around logistics, prices have gone up so high with, like a container going from China to the US, almost gone up 15 times. What's happened in that environment is that the SMEs have been actually priced out of, so these container volumes were rationed, and most of the rationing goes to the benefit of the larger companies because they have the volume. So who's getting really impacted by that? It's really the SMEs that are basically creating 9 out of every 10 new jobs in the emerging markets. So these are the sorts of issues that are problematic with globalization, but I think at the end of the day, we know what the solutions are, and it's, we just need to address them.
Okay, we're going to go to Gucho in 1 second on China, but just Pam, on, we've seen a lot of focus on energy and particularly food recently with the rampant inflation there, and a lot of focus on security of supply. How does that play into this whole situation where countries are more concerned about will they be able to get things rather than necessarily the price of them? How does that play into globalization?
Well, there are two issues, I think. First of all, on the energy front, many of the countries recognize that they need to make that transition to a green energy.
Right.
The biggest challenge is how and the cost. They recognize that one of the studies we've done as ITC is helping SMEs green their businesses. But at the same time, the ecosystem within which those countries exist, or within which those small firms exist, does not necessarily support it. Why? Because the upfront costs of doing greening is problematic. Why? Because solar panels attract sometimes 250% duty. But this Ukraine crisis is actually driving a lot more countries to look at two things. One, energy, shifting to alternative energy quicker than they would have. And two, food security. The Caribbean just had a huge meeting, which we've been trying to get for 30 years. They finally agreed to do internal food sourcing from Guyana, which is 60% less. The Caribbean has a $6 billion a year food bill. 5 million people.
Right.
So globalization, in a sense, is also shifting in terms of the focus on food,
Right.
security, and also energy.
But it sounds like that's coming in to be more domestic and self-sufficient. That's the point, yeah?
In a way, but it also creates opportunity for export. Because if we become more efficient and stop importing a lot of the food that we do.
Okay, so there's a short-term and a long-term.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Gucho, let's go on to you. Let's talk a little bit about, we talked about goods. Let's talk about capital and the flow of capital. So you sit in Hong Kong. Obviously, it's the gateway to China. A lot of money comes through Hong Kong. What is going on with that? Is there a change in those dynamics, or is it still flowing in?
Well, there's without a doubt pressure in terms of like trying to limit the amount of flows potentially, and those are geopolitical pressures. But if we go to the facts and we start looking at what has happened, and we analyze the last 3 years, just not to go back too much, but I talk about this mostly from our own market. So if I look at Hong Kong, where about half of the investors are actually international investors participating in the exchange, our markets. In 2019, our average daily traded volume was about 87 billion Hong Kong dollars per day. In 2020, it grew from 87 to 129. And in 2021, it went from 129 to 167 billion. Mm-hmm. So you can see over this period that everyone is focusing on decoupling, trade war, trying to limit the interactions, companies being kicked out of the US. What we're actually seeing, a tremendous increase in flow. Mm-hmm. And if I look at the amount of money that is actually flowing, we have a program called Connect, which is essentially the way that capital flows on the equity side. 70% of the capital that goes into China for equity investments go through our stock exchange. And if we see what was happening there, over the last 4 or 5 years, that number of capital going into China increased like 5-fold. And if we look at, for example, even in the last year around bonds, we've seen that number go up by 30%. And that number is still tiny in the sense that the amount of foreign investment, international investment into securities in the domestic markets in China today represent less than 5%. So there's still a ton of upside. And if we look at the other way around, investments from domestic individuals, companies, international, Chinese individuals and companies internationally, it's tiny as well. So while the narrative is one of decoupling and pushing aside, yes, there are some elements and some areas that we see that. We really don't see that in the numbers. And if we look at the opportunities that some of those markets present, they're very, very large. Now, obviously, one of the things that we want is we want to make sure that we continue having that capital flow, because that capital is funding companies that, whether it's healthcare companies, whether it's new economy companies that are generating innovation, that are generating new drugs that are saving lives and are very important. So the narrative is there, the pressure is there, but we're not seeing that in the facts now.
So that's securities, that's buying securities. Yeah. What's happening in terms of direct investment? Is that the same story?
Well, I mean, foreign direct investment into China last year was like record high.
Right.
There's been a 77% increase.
So from your perspective, the political noise and the political narrative is not being followed by private sector.
I mean, if we look at the first quarter, we've seen some impact. Yeah. I mean, and the first quarter, there was quite a bit of slowdown. So that's why it's hard to look at it on a quarter by quarter. But the reality is that the natural interaction that should be taking place between East and West needs to go up a lot. I mean, there's a lot of value to be created, but by more interactions between East and West. There's a lot of additional people that can be taken out of poverty by generating more flows between East and West. There's a lot more efficiencies that we can have. Now, of course, it's fair and logical that countries want to take into account national security in a lot of areas, and some countries say, I don't want to rely fully on some products that are manufactured in China or in other countries, and that will continue. Same with data. We're going to see more countries that are going to try to protect their data. But overall, when we look at the big scheme of things, the trend is towards increasing flows and increasing interactions.
So, and just for the sake of this audience, we all, I think, know quite well the narrative coming out of the US when it comes to trade with China. How would you characterize the narrative internally about trade with the US and trade with the world? What is the narrative in China itself?
I mean, I think the point that you hear the most is, how can we make sure that 1 + 1 is more than 2? Okay, how can we create value? How can we create a winning relationship by making sure that the interaction is beneficial for everyone? And that is the focus, I mean, around creating more interaction, more flow of trade. And, but at the same time, there's an interest, and I think on both sides, to make sure that certain areas are protected, and especially those relating to national security.
Okay, Loic or Tarek, do you want to weigh in on what you're seeing in China at all, either of you?
I mean, what we're seeing in China is, again, I'm always trying to refer it back to the consumers. The consumers have the same expectation, the same desire in China as what we're seeing elsewhere. Quality product in a more sustainable manner. The only point probably potentially I would add is to get to more sustainable, greener production, transportation. That will require a lot of capital investments on new technologies. If as a company like P&G, we believe we design innovation for 1 billion consumers, we're going to put a certain amount of money. If we're designing for 5 billion consumers, we're going to be putting a lot more money. A lot more money, a lot more innovation, a lot more breakthrough capabilities is going to be coming our way. So it's along my same pitch is Globalization is a great thing. Consumer expectation, consumer desire tend to converge rather than diverge. Having access to a large set of consumers will continue to allow the private sectors to do the high-level investments climate change will need, which is going to be a fantastic opportunity for all of us. Standing against that wave is going to backfire on countries who are choosing to do so.
So on technology, I mean, this is an important point, of course. The transfer of technology, there are barriers coming up between China and the US. There's obviously a desire to have self-sufficiency in China and not be reliant on the US. With a big challenge like global warming, obviously, if new technologies come through, they need to be disseminated and available very quickly. Pam, do you have any thoughts on that and what needs to change to make sure that does happen?
Yes, I have lots of thoughts.
Go ahead.
No, I think the biggest challenge for me as someone who comes from a developing country and represented that country for years and also the region, the promise of the WTO, IP especially, the TRIPS agreement of transfer of technology, literally showed its underside in COVID. And so many developing countries were flabbergasted and shocked, and still are, by what happened during that period. And so I think that there is a drive to kind of begin to develop their own innovation and technology for vaccine production, one of the things that we're working on. But I think it is very important that that aspect of the intellectual property agreement is actually empowered. Now, the TRIPS waiver is another discussion, which will take up a lot of time. But I think that it is important that action be given to allow other developing countries to get that real technology transfer and development. The second area that I think is also critical is in the digital economy. If the digital economy is doing what it's doing, which we see, it's billions in terms of expansion and so on, but at the same time, 40% of the world is unconnected. 40%. Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, and of that 40%, 70 to 80% are in one continent. That continent has shown through Kenya and other countries, that if the digital divide, or the digital Grand Canyon, as it's now being called, is addressed, the ability, the explosion in development and growth in Africa could be exponential. But there has to be that investment. There has to be that inclusion. If that doesn't happen, then what we're going to see is a huge lacuna in terms of where the digital trade is taking the world, that kind of globalization, and where other countries are left, and the 60% of youth under 25 who are going to be in Africa in 2025, 2030. So I think that's a major issue, that those two need to be addressed.
So let's spend the last few minutes, and please do have questions ready, because I will come to you in about 3 or 4 minutes, on what needs to change going forward. So one of the things that we talked a little bit before this, you mentioned, was how globalization has served some very well. So the middle class in Asia has done pretty well out of this. But you did talk a little bit about African countries which produce commodities but haven't managed to really take advantage of getting to the next level of development. So can you just talk a little bit about how you think globalization, which clearly is in flux, as we've seen from the audience, has to adapt in order to get everybody on board?
In my view, there needs to be a systemic change. And that systemic change has to take into account not just the huge private sector players, but it has to take into account the people on the ground. And I'll give you an example, and it's not unique to Congo. But the Congo provides 70% of the cobalt that goes into phones, electric vehicles, which is driving the green agenda for Europe. But if you look at the economy of the Congo, and we understand the other political issues, but if you look at the economy and the child labor and all the other issues, how is that acceptable to us? And it's not just cobalt. It is virtually every single commodity-dependent country in the world that continues on 400 years of this. And so for me, if we're going to seriously talk about globalization and empowerment and lifting people out of poverty, we have to help them also move up the value chain. Why is cocoa going from Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire to Europe, to the Netherlands? You know, the Netherlands' biggest export is cocoa back to Africa. It's insane. When you think about it, it is insanity. But this continues across the board for every single commodity base. So how do we change that rubric? How do we actually help?
That plays back to Loic's point about
Yes.
regionalization, doesn't it?
Yes.
People actually doing
How
stuff
do you do that?
back at home. So, Loic, just to finish, and then I'll go to questions. How does this play for the US? Because the other, I think, country that has some questions around globalization, or well, there are many countries, but let's talk about the US, which is, you know, the people at the top have done incredibly well out of globalization, but those in manufacturing particularly have had a tough time of it. Does your new regionalization that you see coming, how does that impact that group?
I think it impacts it in a very positive manner. Again, globalization has worked well. What we're only talking about here is some regionalization of the supply chain, essentially out of newly identified constraints, which is lack of reliability of the global transport. The upside can be in two areas. One is production closer to consumption, which has a clear benefit for the workforce. The second one I see, which is only a new untapped opportunity, is from a sustainability standpoint, having consumption closer to production can help us make massive inroads into less carbon, lower footprint. I think it's going to be an area of development that is a fabulous undertaking for all of us in years ahead.
Excellent. Do we have any questions? Yes. So let's start at the back, the gentleman at the back, and then we'll go to the front. Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, good. My name is Mohammed Okash. I'm a global shaper from Somalia. Very interesting and insightful discussion. Thank you to you all. It is true that globalization has been stagnant for quite some time, but there are regions those are advancing globalization, including Africa. Recently, we witnessed that Congo joined the East Africa community, which is making like 300 million people in that single market economy. Africa recently adopted Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which will make Africa the largest single market in the world. So that is, I think, a good thing to be celebrated for. But my concern is, who are the custodians of globalization if we are witnessing stagnant period of globalization by keeping in mind with the rise of populism and nationalist leaders around the world? So what is the role of the private sector, the academia, and any other relevant stakeholders?
Who would you like to pose that to?
Almost anyone.
Who would like to take that?
You want to do that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I was asking if they wanted to take it. No, you're right. The AFCFTA is actually a game changer in terms of Africa. I think it can be one of the most transformational agreements ever signed if it reaches its potential. I think your question is who's the custodian of globalization? The truth is we all are. I think more countries during COVID, yes, became a little nationalistic, but I think that's normal. If you have a sickness in your family, you tend to close in a bit. But the recovery in 2021 has shown that that's not permanent. And I think that what Africa needs to do is begin to really push forward and position itself in terms of the global trade agenda, and actually use the AFCFTA as the platform to do that. I think that will be a powerful standing and messaging.
Although I do think it'll be interesting if the global economy slows down or goes into recession, how much more pressure that puts back on it. We'll see. We have a question at the front, and then we'll go to John afterwards. If we could get a microphone, please. The lady at the front.
Thanks a lot. Silvia Ino, also global shaper from the Brussels hub, and I also work for the European Commission, where I work a lot with low and middle income countries. So my question was to the audience basically regarding rare earth. We have talked about regionalization. You've mentioned this is a trend in the supply chain. That being said, in terms of like, let's say supply chain in terms of rare earths, there is actually a limit as to how much we can regionalize because of structural locations in the world where we can find these earths on which we depend from. So my question to you is, how is your thinking around interdependency that nowadays we're building up, also due to the, of course, the ecological transition? And where do you see in the future, you know, our interdependency growing? For the time being, for instance, Europe is heavily interdependent from China, is trying to diversify its supply chain, but there are a limit of locations where these rare earths can be found. So I just wonder, you know, whether you have any thinking around it and where do you see this going? Thanks a lot. And yeah.
Any particular desire of who answers that, or?
It would be relevant for any in the audience, I would say.
Tarek, do you want
to? Maybe I'll touch on one aspect. I think one of the, problematic areas. I mean, if we had two iPhones, one was net negative carbon produced, and the other produced a lot of carbon. Right now, there's no incentive to actually, you know, other than educating consumers and consumer preferences, there's no policy that will actually drive the sort of change that we need to see, and would allow entrepreneurs to actually work in a way that will help achieve the objectives that you'd like to see in the environment. So there are technologies today that are more cost effective than diesel, that are relevant, that could actually make a big difference, but for one reason or another, because of the regulations that you see in the EU in particular, they're just not feasible to. But with the right level of regulation, and by that I mean even eliminating certain sort of barriers to these technologies, you'd be able to actually make a difference today. What I think the most important thing is we need to get the government out of the way of innovation. That's the biggest problem I see. I mean, if government policy is not enabling innovation, we're going backwards, right? So that's, I think, the key takeaway. Technology exists. There's some really innovative things. If you just, you go around to some of the mobility presentations, technologies that, you know, net negative carbon emissions, more cost-effective diesel, but we're not using them. Why? I don't know why. It's a political discussion. You know, one country maybe wants to produce biofuels, the other one doesn't. These are the issues that need to be addressed that can drive change.
We'll do one final question here at the front.
Thanks very much, Thorold. John Neal, Chairman of Unipart Group. Consumers have benefited enormously from globalization with higher quality products, lower costs, synchronized just-in-time supply chains. So they've allowed their governments as voters to support it. But now we're seeing something different. Single points of failure on PPE, saw people dying. Single point of failure in Germany on gas from Russia. The consequences of Ukraine were yet to impact. So maybe consumers will start to change their minds, and as voters will start to discourage governments from this interconnected global world because it's affecting them personally. They may be willing to pay more money to actually get products and services they can't get. So there's a new world emerging, and we haven't seen the impact of it yet. So to what extent do you think governments will now start to be more allergic to globalization than they were in the past?
Loic, you take it.
Great question. A simpler way to answer is, in my view, citizens and consumers' needs and desire have not changed. The desire for a better product, the desire for good value, the desire for more sustainability in solutions, which is ahead of us, hasn't changed. What we need as business leaders to continue coach and educate is this comes largely behind economies of scale on the way the innovation gets made, regulations, restrictions to free flow of product, to free flow of capital, to free flow of ideas, will make us move backward as opposed to move forward. That's, I think, the business leadership responsibility. Globalization is the solution because of the economies of scales to most of the challenges we face. That is not the most politically easy conversation to have, I agree, but as business leaders, having the good of our planet in mind, that is the story we need to keep communicating, teaching, and preaching, because it's fundamentally the right one.
Good. We are out of time. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to our faculty.
All right, thank you. Great job.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. The story is important. Thank you.